Next up, we have section 1.3. This is going to be a long section. This is very detailed. But it's asking, given a scenario, can you analyze potential indicators associated with application attacks? Now, the common theme behind these terms are the concept of software vulnerabilities and how attackers can exploit them. They refer to various types of attacks that take advantage of weaknesses in software design, implementation, or configuration in order to gain unauthorized access or control over a system. The first term is privilege escalation. Now, privilege escalation is a type of attack that allows an attacker to gain higher levels of access or privilege than they are normally allowed to have. This can be done by exploiting vulnerabilities in the system's access controls or by finding a way to execute code with higher privileges. Now, privilege escalation can be physical or it can be technical. So, for example, somebody gets access to an intern's username and password, so they get into the system. Now, that intern doesn't have the same privileges. That intern doesn't have the same access as the database administrator. But once they're in the system, they can now start figuring out ways of getting the DBA's password. So maybe they can't hack into the database, but they may be able to go through some documentation or get access to HR records and figure out, some information that helps them crack the database administrator's password. And then once they can sign in as the DBA, then they've escalated their privileges. Or there's other backend ways of doing it, but that in general is privilege escalation. Cross-site scripting, or XSS. This is a type of attack that allows an attacker to inject malicious code into a web page that gets viewed by other people. And this can be used to steal sensitive information and take control of your entire browser. So, for example, if you go to a website and that website executes some JavaScript, and nowadays you have to, in general, grant permission to that website to interact with your hardware. But there are days past when you go to a certain website, and if you had Flash installed, for example, Flash could interact with your CPU, it can interact with your computer and get your computer to perform certain actions. Next up, we have injections, and these are a broad category of attacks, but in general, they're injecting malicious code or data into the system. The most common term that you'll see associated with injection are SQL injection attacks, and these use malicious input to manipulate a database. Then there's also command injection attacks, which is malicious input to execute commands on the system. I would focus on SQL injection. SQL injection, you can think of it as if you're in a system and you want to look up a set of records, those records may live in a SQL database. So when you perform that search and try to get those records back, what an attacker can do is, instead of just using common text and numbers, they can try to insert a command into that search box so that they can get results back from that search that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. So that's a common example of a SQL injection attack. Pointer or object deference is a type of vulnerability that occurs in languages like C and C++. This is going to occur when a program accesses memory that it should not be able to access, and it allows an attacker to take control of that program. Directory traversal. This is a vulnerability that lets the attacker access files or directories outside of their intended directory. It can be used to steal sensitive information or upload malicious files. So you can think of this, a common example is, you have a secure folder and only a certain number of people should have access to it. But if there are linked files within that folder that can be accessed, outside of the folder, and someone figures out, a pathway into that folder, um, they can hop from one directory to another. So if they're able to escape that secure environment, hop from one area to another, it could be a site, it could be a table in the database. They're traversing their intended direction. Next up are race conditions. So race conditions are a type of vulnerability that happen when a system's behavior is dependent on timing, right? So think of race as, getting to the finish line, like which operation is going to execute first, right? So attackers can exploit these vulnerabilities to gain unauthorized access or control of your system, right? So when a race condition occurs, somebody is trying to execute their code before the system's code gets run, and get it and kind of cut off the either the error handling or the security that happens around that operation. So if they can get their code to run before, the secure part of the code gets run, then they can perform their attack. Okay, checking in, see if anybody else joined here. Not yet. Error handling vulnerabilities happen when a system does not properly handle errors or exceptions. Now, when error handling and race conditions can go hand in hand, because typically that the condition that causes that error to execute happens at the end of a particular command or a set of scripts. So if the error does not execute before the malicious code executes, then it could cause an entire system to shut down. Next up, we have improper input handling. And these vulnerabilities happen when a system does not validate or sanitize input. One way of checking for improper input handling is what's called fuzzing. So you'll see the term fuzzing a lot in these certifications. And fuzzing basically allows you to test out whether throwing code, throwing scripts, or SQL into a text box or an input box, if that's going to cause the system to malfunction or cause the system to be vulnerable to attack. Now, a replay attack, this is going to involve intercepting and replaying a valid request or communication to gain access to a system. So say for example, you're in your bank account and you send money to somebody. Now, if somebody is in your system and they're able to, watch as these commands get executed, they can capture that set of commands and then replay it so that, you're making these transactions over and over and over again. Now, a replay attack is, it typically requires that someone is already, within your system and can track what's happening. But there are other ways for replay attacks to occur. So it can be as simple as a button click and, just getting that action getting, sent through the browser over and over again. Next up, we have integer overflow. And this vulnerability is when a program's calculation results in a value that is too large to be represented by the computer. Now, an integer overflow is like, for example, if a text box can only handle a certain number of characters, but it will throw an error otherwise, if the input is too large. But what happens if the calculation is so large that the system can't even handle processing whether or not it's in error or not, right? So that can cause your application to shut down or, your database to become unresponsive. If they flood your your application with data, and you haven't handled, you know, that amount of data being sent, it can cause integer overflow. Request forgeries are a type of attack that involves tricking a user into performing an action on a website without their knowledge or consent. This can be used to steal some sensitive information, and it can also be used to perform actions on the user's behalf, right? So a request, you know, using the bank account example again, is like you've already authenticated, but if your credentials are being unmasked by an attacker that can already uh, you know, see the traffic that's happening on the network, they can forge those requests that you're making and act as you, but send your transfer to a different account. Application programming interface, or API attacks. These will refer to the attacks targeting web APIs. They can include actions like sending malicious payloads, distributed denial of service attacks, or manipulating the API calls to gain unauthorized access to a system. You're going to see a lot of this on the test, so make sure you pay attention. Resource exhaustion. This is going to refer to an attack that aims to consume all of your system's resources, causing it to become unavailable or unresponsive. So, for example, if you remember, I don't know how old any of you guys are, but if you remember back in the day, if you downloaded some malicious, if you downloaded a virus, for example, if you're on MySpace, you download, you know, a song file or an MP3 that has, you know, malicious code on it, it'll um, it'll execute a file that just consumes all of your memory, right? Lock up your computer, you can't do anything. And a lot of times this is just, you know, like hackers would just do this for fun, just to see how many people they could get to install, you know, install these applications or install these viruses on their computer just to lock up people's computers. Nowadays, it's typically ransomware. So, you know, resource exhaustion will cause, you know, systems to lock up. Nobody can log in, and in order to get that malicious file removed or that virus removed, you'll have to pay the attacker a certain amount. Now, memory leak is a type of vulnerability that happens when a program does not properly manage memory. So in coding, as your code executes, it starts to build up a lot of, what's the word for it? Think of it as every time an action is performed, there's like it's like a line, it's like a ledger, right? So it's adding to the ledger, is adding to the ledger. If you ever had to like clear your cache, you know, you had to clear your memory. So if you're not clearing that buildup often enough, it can cause depletion of resources, kind of like resource exhaustion, right? And this can be part of a larger attack. So it's not going to be, it may not be immediate, but over time, it's, you know, if you're not properly removing that memory, it can affect your entire application. Next is SSL stripping, secure sockets layer stripping. This is a type of attack that involves removing or modifying the SSL or TLS encryption from a website. What this does is it allows an attacker to view or modify sensitive information. So SSL allows for secure transmitting of data across, let's just say across the network. Now, if somebody removes SSL from the website, that means that the data is exposed and it can be vulnerable to um, uh, something like what's called a man in the middle attack, where somebody can monitor that traffic, which would typically be encrypted, and pick up things like passwords, usernames, account numbers, um, pretty much anything that is going across across that pipeline. Driver manipulation is a type of attack that involves modifying or replicating legitimate device drivers with malicious ones. Now, this can allow an attacker to gain control of the system because just like we talked about with supply chain attacks, if there's malicious hardware within your device, whether it be a phone or a laptop, that means that anytime you're using your memory, you're using your CPU, anytime you're performing an action that requires processing that data can be sent somewhere else, or it can be stored on the device somewhere where you don't have access to, only to later be exploited by an attacker. So there could be a buildup of data within a certain area, eventually that gets sent out when the attacker is ready to extract it. And lastly, we have pass the hash. Pass the hash is a type of attack that involves stealing a user's hashed password. So when we talk about a hash is like a it's like a code word, right? So it's kind of like how we use the 256 digit example. A hash is going to represent a different word or phrase, right? So if that hash gets, and that hash is not always sent when you're performing an action, but if that hash gets sent to the wrong target, it can then start to be manipulated and used in a cracker. So the cracker is going to look at that that hexadecimal, or that string of characters, and which is the hash, and try to break it apart and see what it's actually meant to represent.